In this video, I'm going to take a look at how we can write data to a file. Here you can see we've got an algorithm that has 4 steps. The first step is where we would form the data within our program that we wish to save to a file. Step 2, we open the file for writing. Step 3, you write the data to the file. And step 4, we close the file to free up any resources that were used when we opened the file. Let's move on and consider the setup we would have with our computer program implementing the algorithm we've just looked at. You would have Python code and you would have the operating system. Now we know the Python code will work by cooperating with the operating system. And what I'd like to do is to move that to the bottom here, so we now can have a look at the code that implements the algorithm. Let's consider the first line of the code where you can see data is assigned the string hello world. Now I could have chosen a better name than data for the variable, but this will do for this demo program. So we've set up a string and I'm going to write this string to a file. We now can turn our attention to the next line of the program, and here you can see we're using the open statement, and we're going to be opening this file here, and we're going to be opening it to write to. So you can see in this position we've got file to store data.txt, and then a comma, and then a single character string with W between the quotes, which means that the file is going to be open for writing to. And if you remember in the previous videos when we wanted to read from the file, we didn't have W here, we had R. Now this assignment is important because you can see we're assigning to my file. Now my file is now going to be an object reference to a stream which will connect the Python code to the text file. So this second line of the program will create the text file, as you can see coming into view now. And if you look at the name, you can see it's file to store data.txt, which reflects this here, which was the name I give it in the computer program. Now, because this file is going to be part of the operating system file system, then we're going to have a relationship between the operating system and this file, which I'm showing with this connection here. Now, when this second line of the computer program executes, what will happen is resources will be set aside which will hold things such as the descriptor to the file, so the Python program will know where the file is in the file system. And these resources essentially take up part of the computer's memory. So I'm going to show that coming into view within the operating system schematic diagram, as you can see now. So these resources are placed here, and now the Python code will use these resources to gain access to the file. And conceptually, what we will have is a connection between the Python code and the file to where I'm going to store the data. Now, this is referred to as a stream, and it is an object. It's an object of a particular class, and the name of this object, the object reference to it, is coming into view now. It's my file. And of course, my file is this in the program, the variable name that I decided to use. And we have to realize that this variable name is essentially pointing to the stream. It's an object reference to the stream. The program now moves on to execute the third line. And if you look, you can see that this is the object reference, and the object will have this method which will write this data that was created on this line to the file that was created on this line. So if we look to the schematic diagram, what we're going to see is data moving from the Python code to the file. And there is the data being moved. When I say moved, I mean that the data has been written to the file. A copy of the data has been written to the file. The code then moves on to execute the fourth line, where you can see you're going to close the stream. Now, the closing of the stream is important because what it will do, it'll release the resources that were used to say where the file was in the file system, and it frees up the area of memory that was set aside to be used for other things. So you always, when you open the file, have to remember at an appropriate point in time, close the file to free up resources to be used elsewhere. So if you look to the schematic diagram, what will happen? The resources and the stream no longer exist. So when this program executes, we can go to the operating system and use an appropriate editor to open up the file that I've just written to. And you can see that that's coming into view now. And if you look here, you can see that it's hello world. And this reflects what I placed here in my program code, showing that the program did indeed write the data to, in this case, a text file. It's also worth noting, if we look at this editor, you can see here that the file I'm looking at is file to store data.txt, which indeed is this name here that I put in the computer program. Before I move on with the rest of the video, I'd like to highlight the following in case you haven't noticed. If you look at this file name, you can see that it had to appear within these quotes. And if you look at the W, you can see that also had to appear within quotes. Many people, when they first start using this approach to writing information to files, often forget to put the quotes in, as you can see them in this program. And they will get a syntax error if they do that. Let's move on and return to look at the second program statement and look at it in a little bit more detail. Now I've brought it into view at a bigger size, as you can see. If this file does not exist, the open statement will create it, and it'll create it in the same folder as the Python code. So when you open a file, if it's not part of the file system, this statement will actually create it. Now, we have to be careful with this, and I'll come on to that a little bit later. But something else we can say about this file name is we could put a path in front of it. So this can also be a path to the file, where the path would be to a different folder, a different directory, and when we use this statement, the file will be placed in that other folder. So it doesn't have to be in the same folder as your Python program. But again, we need to be careful when we're file handling, and I'll come back to talk about that in a moment. I've already discussed the fact that when this program statement executes, what's going to happen? It'll create the file in the same directory, the same folder as the Python program file. So the open statement, as shown here with the W, where we're opening it for writing, will create this file. Now, will this cause us any trouble? Well, the question is, what if you've already got this file in your file system and it's called file to store data.txt, identical to the name you've got in your program? Well, it's going to create the file again. So what will happen to the contents of the old file that had the same name? Where will that be? Will it be in this new file that you've just created? Well, the short answer is no, it won't. Whatever you had stored in that file will be lost. So you have to make sure that when you're manipulating files, when you first start off coding with these types of programs that I'm showing you, is choose a silly name for your file name, as I've done here. It's highly unlikely that I'm going to have something called file to store data.txt with anything meaningful in it. So when you're manipulating files, just bear in mind that when you suddenly decide I'm going to write to a file, make sure it's not a file that already exists, and make sure it's not a file that already exists with important information in it. Choose silly names until you know exactly what you're doing. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't write to a file that already exists. It's just that you have to amend this open statement, which I'll be covering in a different video later in the playlist. But what you really need to remember is the following. If the file already exists, this open statement will replace the file contents. You'll still have a file called file2store data.txt, but it has effectively replaced what was already there with the same name. So you just need to be a little bit careful. You can also add program statements to the code to avoid the possibility of writing to files that already exist, but we'll look at that later in the playlist.